They sold my house while I was still under anesthesia. My son signed the papers before I'd even woken up from surgery. When the nurse told me the property had changed ownership, she thought she was giving me good news, said something about how nice it must be to have a son so responsible. I remember lying there, the IV dripping rhythmically, the smell of disinfectant thick in the air, and thinking that the word responsible had never sounded so cruel. I didn't even feel anger at first. It was more like my body had been hollowed out, emptied quietly, efficiently, like the rooms of the house he had just sold from under me. I tried to imagine strangers walking across the floorboards where my husband's slippers used to sit, touching the window latches I had painted myself one spring when I was 45, and foolishly believed time would wait for us. I am 80 now. I live in a small studio above a bakery that starts its work before dawn. The smell of yeast wakes me before the light does, and sometimes I think that is the only warmth I need. The radio keeps me company. The same morning program that talks about real estate prices, economic forecasts, and all the other things that make people think they have control. I listen with the kind of detached amusement that only the betrayed can afford. It's strange how quickly you learn to stop yearning for justice and start treasuring silence. I water my plants every morning, 3 geraniums and a fern that refuses to die, and I keep the hospital bracelet in the drawer beside my bed. The plastic has turned yellow, the printed letters nearly gone, but it still fits around my wrist. It reminds me of the moment I crossed from being a woman with a home to a woman who simply rents space in the world. People always ask how it could happen, as though betrayal required drama, a slammed door, a fight, a witness. But the worst betrayals are procedural. They come with paperwork, signatures, notarized seals. My son Mark had offered to help with the taxes. He said the bills were overdue, that the city might seize the property. He'd spoken with the confidence of someone who had learned that tone was a substitute for truth. I trusted him because that's what mothers do, even when they shouldn't. I was recovering from a fall, still dizzy from medication, the world soft around the edges. He came to the hospital with flowers and a folder. He said, "Mom, just sign this so I can sort everything out." His smile was kind, his voice patient, the tone sons use when they think they're smarter than time itself. I signed. My hand trembled a little, but not from doubt, just age. Then he kissed my forehead, took the papers, and left before the nurse came to change the IV. When I returned home 2 weeks later, the house didn't look wrong at first. It smelled different, like citrus instead of dust. The curtains were open, though I never left them that way. There was a white car parked in the driveway I didn't recognize. I tried the key, but it stuck, turned halfway, then stopped. A woman opened the door. She was polite, startled, and told me she'd just moved in. Behind her, a man carried a box labeled kitchen. I said, "There must be some mistake. This is my house." She shook her head and said gently, "Ma'am, we bought this from your son last month." That's when the world tilted, not violently, but in that slow, nauseating way that feels almost merciful, because it gives you time to absorb each shard of disbelief. I walked away without a word, down the sidewalk, my cane clicking against the concrete like a metronome, keeping time with my humiliation. I went to Mark's apartment. The doorman said he wasn't in. I waited in the lobby until the light outside turned amber, then gray. When he finally arrived, he looked surprised, almost annoyed. "Mom, you shouldn't be out," he said. "You'll catch cold." He guided me into the elevator like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. In his living room, the baby toys and the television noise filled the air. His wife didn't come out of the bedroom. He poured tea, sat across from me, and began explaining things, the market, the taxes, the maintenance costs. He spoke as if he were presenting a quarterly report, every sentence a shield against guilt. I listened, not because I wanted to understand, but because silence would have sounded too much like begging. When he finally said, "It's just a house, Mom," I felt something inside me settle, not break. There's a difference. Breaking means you still care about repair. Settling means you finally know there's nothing left to fix. That night, I slept in a cheap motel near the hospital, the kind that smells faintly of bleach and cigarettes. I counted the cracks in the ceiling until I lost track. Somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, I realized I wasn't crying. Not because I was strong, but because I was too tired to manufacture emotion for people who had already priced it out of me. I got up, made weak coffee in the plastic machine, and wrote my name on the motel notepad in shaky letters. Eleanor Price. I looked at it for a long time, as if seeing it on paper could remind me who I was before my name was just a line on a deed. Someone else cashed. Now, years later, the anger has faded into a kind of clarity. I understand things I didn't before. How love can coexist with exploitation. How family can become the most elegant form of theft. I understand how easily trust is monetized when you're old, when your hands shake just enough for them to call it confusion. I remember how Mark used to call me his rock, how he'd say he couldn't have gone to college without me. I paid his tuition by taking extra shifts at the clinic, by selling the small jewelry pieces my husband had given me before the cancer took him. I used to think sacrifice was a currency that earned you loyalty. It isn't. It's a discount code they use until it expires. Sometimes I dream of the house, the way the morning light touched the dining room wall, the faint smell of varnish in the hallway, the sound of rain hitting the old roof tiles. In the dream, I'm not walking through it as an owner or a ghost. I'm just a passerby, glancing in through the window. I see another woman there, arranging flowers in a vase I once owned. She hums to herself. I don't hate her. I envy her ignorance of what those walls have witnessed. I wake up before she turns around. I keep a photo of Mark as a child on my dresser, 7 years old, missing a front tooth, holding a toy hammer. Beneath it, in my handwriting, "Don't forget where you come from." Sometimes I wonder if he ever looks in a mirror and hears that echo. Other times I hope he doesn't. The truth is, I don't want him haunted. I just want him to remember I was real. So yes, they sold my house while I was in the hospital. They sold the walls that heard my laughter, the floors that creaked under decades of care. But I'm still here, living above a bakery that smells like survival. I have no illusions left about family or fairness. I have my plants, my radio, and the steady knowledge that losing everything can sometimes be the first honest thing that ever happens to you. And every morning when I hear the baker downstairs kneading dough, I whisper to myself, it was just a house. Then I smile because I know better now. It was never just a house. It was me. And I learned that even when they sell you, you can still belong to yourself. When people ask me when exactly it began, when the betrayal became real, I tell them it was the day the papers appeared, the day my son came into the hospital room wearing his business smile. It was the smile he used when convincing clients to sign something that wasn't quite what they thought it was. I had seen that expression before, years ago, when he was still a teenager selling raffle tickets for school and convincing neighbors to buy 5 instead of 1 because it's for a good cause. That boy had grown into a man who spoke in calm tones and corporate sentences. He entered the room with a folder under his arm, a bouquet of supermarket flowers in his hand, and a look that was part affection, part calculation. He kissed my forehead and told me not to worry about the bills or the property tax notices piling up on my kitchen table. He said he had spoken with someone at the bank and that everything could be simplified if I just signed a few documents. I remember the way his words filled the room, soft and heavy, like fog that hides cliffs until you've already stepped too far. I was groggy from the pain medication, half aware of the slow pulse of the heart monitor beside me. The nurse had just changed my IV. I remember trying to lift my head and asking, "What is it exactly?" He smiled, reassuring, patient. "Just the refinancing, Mom. It's all the same house, just in a different tax category. I'll manage everything so you don't have to stress." I wanted to believe him. I think part of me knew that belief was the only thing left between us. He laid the folder on my lap, took out a pen, and pointed to the lines marked with sticky tabs. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be. The letters swam a little, but I could still read my own name. There it was, printed neatly in black ink. Eleanor Price, owner of record. He guided my hand gently to the signature line. I hesitated for only a moment, long enough for him to say softly, "Trust me." 2 words that have destroyed more lives than hate ever could. I signed. He thanked me, tucked the pages back into the folder, and said he'd drop them off at the bank before heading home. Then he told me to rest, that he'd call tomorrow. He didn't. The next morning, the nurse came to check my chart and mentioned casually, "Your son's already handled the house transfer. You're lucky to have family so organized." I didn't understand what she meant, not at first. "Transfer?" I asked, and she smiled, assuming I knew. "The property forms he filed. He said you wanted everything settled before discharge." I nodded slowly, pretending that was true. It was easier to let her think I was in control. That afternoon, I asked for my purse, pulled out my old flip phone, and called Mark. Straight to voicemail. I tried again in the evening, then the next day. Nothing. By the time they discharged me, I had convinced myself it was just paperwork, some technical adjustment. The mind invents softer versions of truth when it knows the real one will kill you. The hospital volunteer wheeled me to the exit. Outside, the world felt sharper, louder, less forgiving. I took a taxi home. The driver helped with my bag, asked for the address, and said, "Nice neighborhood." When we turned the corner, I saw a moving truck parked in front of my house. 2 men were unloading furniture I'd never seen before. I thought maybe Mark had hired cleaners, decorators, something. But then I saw the realtor's sign still leaning against the tree by the sidewalk, the one that had been there months earlier when he'd said, "Don't worry, Mom. That's just for another listing I'm managing." I'd believed that too. I told the driver to stop. My hand shook as I got out, the crutches awkward beneath my arms. A young couple stood at the gate. The woman wore sunglasses. The man was carrying a rolled-up rug. They smiled politely, assuming I was a neighbor. When I said my name, they exchanged a glance. "Oh," the man said after a moment, "are you Mrs. Price, the previous owner? We were told you'd already relocated." Relocated. The word landed like a diagnosis. I managed to nod. "Yes," I said softly. "Apparently I have." That night I slept at a small roadside motel on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of rain and exhaust. I sat on the bed with the documents still in my purse, the same ones I had signed without reading. I pulled them out and studied the pages under the yellow lamp. They weren't refinancing papers. They were a sale contract, notarized, witnessed, sealed. The sale had gone through the day after my surgery. The payment had been transferred to an account under his name as the executor of my estate, as if I had already died. My signature was shaky, but there. I remember touching it with my fingertips, not in disbelief, but in a kind of grim respect for my own compliance. There's a peculiar clarity that comes when you realize you participated in your own undoing. In the following days, I made the rounds: the bank, the city records office, the lawyer who had once handled my late husband's affairs. Every door I knocked on gave me the same response. Legally, it's clean. You granted power of attorney. The sale was voluntary. Voluntary. That word, too, became its own kind of wound. The law doesn't recognize manipulation when it's wrapped in family love. To them, an elderly woman's trust is not evidence of exploitation, but proof of consent. I sat in the lawyer's waiting room for nearly an hour after he told me there was nothing to be done. He offered me a bottle of water and a pamphlet about senior protection hotlines. I thanked him, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my bag, knowing I'd never call. In the weeks that followed, I tried to reach Mark again. Once, his wife answered. Her voice was brittle, the kind of politeness that cuts. "He's not home," she said. I asked when he'd be back, and she replied, "He's very busy. We're moving soon." Then, almost as an afterthought, "It's better this way. Less worry for everyone." Less worry. As though my erasure were a favor. I hung up and stared at the wall for a long time, realizing that what hurt most wasn't the theft itself, but how easily they justified it. I rented a room in a boarding house near the river. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the smell of mildew clung to the curtains, but it was shelter. I spent the first nights replaying every conversation we'd ever had about the house. The repairs, the taxes, the winters when the pipes froze, and he'd promised to help but never came. I remembered the day his father and I signed the first mortgage, the joy of owning something solid. We'd painted the porch ourselves. He was 10, running barefoot across the lawn, laughing as the dog chased him. I remember telling him, "One day this will be yours." I hadn't realized I was giving him permission to take it long before I meant to. It's strange how betrayal erases your sense of time. Those weeks after the hospital felt like one long gray afternoon. The body heals faster than the heart. My hip grew stronger, but I moved slower, as if waiting for a reason to keep walking. Sometimes I'd catch myself imagining that Mark would come, that he'd knock on the door of that damp little room and say it was all a mistake. But the knock never came. Instead, I received a letter from his attorney, brief and bloodless, informing me that the sale was final and that my belongings had been placed in a storage unit paid for 3 months in advance. There was no note from Mark inside, just the lawyer's closing line: "We trust this arrangement provides you comfort." Comfort. I went to the storage facility 2 days later. The manager led me down a corridor of metal doors, each one humming faintly in the heat. Inside my unit were boxes labeled kitchen, books, miscellaneous. I opened one. My wedding china, chipped from years of use, wrapped carelessly in newspaper. Another box held framed photos, the glass cracked on one, the faces warped by pressure. I sat on the cold concrete floor and went through them one by one, touching each image like a wound. In one photo, Mark at 5 years old, holding a toy sailboat. In another, his high school graduation, his arm around me, both of us squinting in the sun. I wondered when exactly he had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obstacle. I left the unit locked and walked along the river until dusk. The water moved slow and brown, carrying leaves and bits of trash toward a horizon that didn't care who owned what. I thought about the nurse's words again. How lucky I was to have family so organized. That night, I laughed for the first time in weeks, not from joy, but from the absurdity of it. I laughed until my ribs ached, until the laughter turned into coughing. When it stopped, I felt strangely calm. The world had already decided I was expendable, so why keep fighting to prove otherwise? That was the night something inside me hardened and shifted. I wasn't going to be anyone's paperwork anymore. That was the true beginning, not the signing, not the discovery, but the decision to stop waiting for remorse. I realized that if I wanted any kind of peace, I would have to build it from what was left of me. That moment, sitting in the dark by the river with my storage key digging into my palm, was when I understood the depth of my son's betrayal. He hadn't just taken a house. He'd rewritten the map of my existence. And still, somehow, I was alive, breathing, aware. That awareness was the first brick in a new foundation. I didn't know it yet, but everything that would come after, the quiet, the independence, the strange freedom of having nothing, started right there, in the aftermath of his signature. In the months that followed, life folded into something narrow, almost two-dimensional, as if I'd been flattened between the pages of my own history. The boarding house near the river became a kind of purgatory for the discarded. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. Someone's radio murmured old songs through the thin walls at all hours, and a woman down the corridor coughed so deeply each night that I found myself timing my breaths to her rhythm. My room had one small window facing an alley and a radiator that hissed like it was gossiping. The wallpaper peeled in soft curls, and when I couldn't sleep, I'd pick at it until the plaster showed, then press my fingertip to the rough surface just to feel something solid. The landlord's wife called me Miss Price, even though she knew my first name. It was easier for everyone to keep the distance that titles provide. I paid my rent in cash, on time, always with the small thrill of remembering that even this crumbling space was still mine to control, a lesson that had taken 77 years and one catastrophic betrayal to learn. The days moved with the slow persistence of fog. I woke early out of habit, brewed instant coffee, and sat by the window watching the alley cats conduct their morning negotiations. Sometimes I imagined them as miniature realtors dividing territory, meowing over boundaries, calculating whose dumpster was worth more. I had stopped hearing from Mark entirely. The first few weeks I checked the mailbox with a trace of hope, then only out of discipline, and finally out of dull curiosity. All I ever found were bills and supermarket flyers. The absence of his handwriting became its own steady rhythm. Each empty envelope was another note in the long song of silence he composed for me. Eventually, I ventured beyond the river road, more out of restlessness than purpose. My hip ached, but I moved carefully, tracing the streets I used to drive decades ago, when the world still felt like it had openings instead of walls. The city had grown shinier, crueler, new cafes where laundromats used to stand, glass condominiums that reflected the sky so perfectly it looked as though the heavens belonged to them. I passed a bakery with a sign that read, "Help Wanted, Mornings Only." The smell of yeast and sugar pulled me in before I even decided. The owner was a woman about my age, short, round-shouldered, wearing a stained apron and an expression that had seen everything. She said her name was Celine. When I asked about the job, she laughed softly and said, "You sure you want to stand for 5 hours straight?" I told her I'd stood longer for less reward. Something in that answer must have pleased her, because she handed me a hairnet and told me to come back Monday. That first shift nearly broke me. The dough was heavy, the oven relentless, my hands too slow for her rhythm. But by noon, I'd learned the choreography of survival. Knead, fold, wait, breathe. Celine paid me in cash, no paperwork, no questions. At the end of the day, she gave me a roll of bread still warm from the oven. I carried it home like treasure, the scent filling the hallway before I even reached my door. The landlady's husband asked if I'd robbed a bakery. I told him I'd earned it. The crust was crisp enough to remind me that not everything softens with age. Working there gave my days a skeleton again. I began to sleep through the night, though dreams still came in fragments. The sound of Mark's voice, the slam of a car door, the echo of footsteps in a house that was no longer mine. In the mornings, I rose before dawn and walked to the bakery under a sky bruised with early light. The city smelled of wet asphalt and coffee grounds. I discovered a kind of peace in repetition. The dough didn't care who had betrayed me. The ovens didn't demand explanations. Celine would hum old songs from the 60s while shaping loaves, and sometimes she'd say, "People think bread is about patience, but really it's about trust. You trust the yeast to rise, the heat to hold." I nodded each time because I understood. I had trusted and been burned, but still, each morning I set the dough to rise. When I wasn't working, I started volunteering at the thrift store 2 blocks from the bakery. The manager, a tall man with a limp, needed help sorting donations. The place smelled of dust and forgotten perfume. I mended torn pockets, polished brass buttons, and learned to read the quiet stories clothes carry. The perfume on a collar, the lipstick mark on a sleeve, the faint ghost of sweat in a uniform jacket. Each item was a life once worn proudly, now surrendered to strangers. I found comfort in the anonymity of it. In a world that had taken everything with my name on it, I could at least care for the nameless. One afternoon, while sorting a box of donations, I found a small silver key tied to a faded ribbon. It wasn't labeled. The manager told me to toss it, but I slipped it into my pocket instead. That evening, I placed it on my bedside table next to the hospital bracelet. 2 relics of ownership, one lost unwillingly, one found by chance. Sometimes I'd pick it up and imagine it fit the lock to my old house, though I knew it didn't. It was just metal and memory, but holding it steadied me. Letters from institutions began to find me again. Pension updates, medical reminders, forms to be filled out. Bureaucracy, the one family that never forgets. I answered each letter neatly, handwriting careful and even, as though correctness might keep me safe. When the social worker called to confirm my address, she hesitated, recognizing it as the low-income boarding district. Her tone shifted instantly, polite pity replacing efficiency. I told her she didn't need to worry. I was doing fine. She asked if my son was helping. I said yes, because saying no felt like confessing failure. Winter came early that year. The bakery's ovens became my only reliable warmth. My hands cracked from the flour and the cold, but Celine gave me a pair of gloves and told me to keep them. At night, I'd sit on my narrow bed, counting my wages, small bills folded carefully into an envelope I kept hidden inside an empty tea tin. The sound of the money rustling reminded me that I still had agency, that there was a future, even if it was modest. Sometimes, lying awake, I imagined Mark in his bright condo, the one he'd bought after selling my house. I pictured the marble counters, the wine glasses his wife had chosen, the way he probably never thought of me except as a problem already solved. I didn't hate him. Hate requires energy I no longer wished to waste. What I felt was something colder, heavier, a slow erasure of maternal instinct, the death of reflexive forgiveness. Around Christmas, the landlady organized a small dinner for the tenants. We sat around a plastic table covered with mismatched plates. Someone brought canned ham, someone else a cake that collapsed in the middle. There was cheap wine and laughter that came too quickly, as if we were all trying to drown out the echo of what we'd lost. When my turn came to speak, I raised my glass and said, "To the people who survive what others think will kill them." A few nodded. One woman clapped softly. That was enough. Not long after, I received a postcard without a return address. It was a picture of the Old Town Pier, the kind I used to take Mark to when he was little. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were 3 words. "I'm sorry, Mom." There was no name, no signature. It might not even have been from him. The postmark was smudged beyond reading. I kept it anyway, propped it against the window where the light faded each evening. I studied those 3 words for days, wondering whether they were an apology or a manipulation, whether he wrote them out of guilt or calculation. Then one morning, the card slipped behind the radiator, and I didn't bother to retrieve it. Some things are meant to be lost twice. The thaw came late, and with it a strange restlessness. The bakery's routine no longer soothed me. The thrift store's silence felt too heavy. I started walking further each afternoon, past the river, past the bus station, into neighborhoods I didn't know. I'd stop at small parks and watch children play, their laughter carrying easily in the wind. I tried to imagine Mark as a boy again, the smell of his hair after a bath, the way he'd run to me when he scraped his knee. The memory didn't hurt as much as it used to. It just felt like reading an old book whose ending you already know. One evening after closing, Celine handed me an envelope. "You've been underpaid," she said gruffly. Inside were a few extra bills. "You work like someone who's still proving something," she added. I smiled and told her I had already proven everything I needed to. But that night, counting the money at my desk, I realized she was right. I was still working to justify my existence, still measuring worth in productivity, the habit of a woman who'd spent her life giving everything away. That winter ended, then another began, and I kept moving, quietly, steadily. My world had shrunk to a few blocks, a handful of people, a routine as fragile as glass, but within it I felt an emerging strength. The grief was still there, yes, but it no longer ruled me. It had become a dull companion, sitting across from me at breakfast, nodding while I buttered my toast. I didn't yet know what freedom would look like, but I could sense it, faint and shimmering at the edges of my small, rebuilt life. And so the first escalation was not some grand event, but the gradual reclamation of self through ordinary survival. Each loaf of bread, each repaired coat, each morning I woke without dread. These were quiet rebellions, the kind that leave no headlines, but change everything inside. I was no longer waiting for justice or apology. I was waiting for the day I would wake up and realize I didn't need either. That realization was coming, slow as spring, inevitable as dawn. And though I couldn't see it fully yet, I felt it breathing somewhere ahead of me, patient and sure. It was almost 2 years after the sale when I realized I had stopped waiting for anything to return. My house, my son's voice, my old sense of security. What surprised me was not the loss itself, but how light I began to feel without it, as though grief, when carried long enough, burns itself into air. By then, I was working 6 mornings a week at the bakery and spending afternoons at the thrift store. Celine said I was too old to push myself so hard, but I told her that stillness frightened me more than fatigue. The boarding house had emptied out. The coughing woman down the hall had moved to a nursing facility, and her room smelled of bleach for weeks after. I started keeping my door open in the evenings, just to let air and sound in, and sometimes Celine would stop by after closing with a loaf that didn't sell or a bottle of cheap wine she pretended to hate. We would sit by the window, listening to the city hum beneath us, 2 women on the far edge of their usefulness, laughing about things that no longer mattered. One gray morning, I woke with the distinct sense that something was changing, though nothing tangible had. The air outside felt softer, a little forgiving, and the bakery had a new sign in the window. New ownership coming soon. Celine told me she was selling the business. Her knees couldn't take the work anymore, and her daughter wanted her to move, closer to the coast. For a moment, I felt panic rise, the reflex of someone who has had too much taken. But she placed her flour-dusted hand on mine and said, "You'll be fine, Eleanor. You're steadier than you think." That afternoon, she gave me a small box of odds and ends, measuring spoons, a chipped mug, a notepad with half the pages blank, and told me to take them for when you bake again somewhere new. I carried that box home like a relic. The new owner never arrived. Weeks turned into months, and the bakery stayed shuttered, its windows dark. I passed by every day on my walk to the thrift store, feeling a small ache each time, the kind of ache you get when you see your own handwriting on something that no longer belongs to you. But something inside me was beginning to resist despair. I found myself looking for ways to keep moving, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. There was a community center a few blocks from the river that offered free workshops, computer literacy, English conversation for immigrants, sewing, painting. One afternoon I walked in, mostly to get out of the rain, and a woman with sharp eyes and a kind voice handed me a flyer about a writing class for seniors. "You don't have to be a writer," she said. "You just have to remember things." That line stayed with me. I started attending on Thursdays. The class was held in a small room that smelled of chalk and instant coffee. The teacher, a retired journalist named B., encouraged us to write about moments, not stories. "Moments tell the truth," she said. "Stories tell the excuses." At first I wrote simple things. The first time I baked bread, the sound of my husband's laugh, the day Mark was born. Then, without meaning to, I wrote about the house. The pen moved faster than I expected, as if it had been waiting years for permission. When I finished, B read the page quietly and said, "You have a way of telling pain that doesn't ask for pity. That's rare." I didn't know whether it was praise or diagnosis, but it made me feel real again. Soon I was writing every night. I bought a notebook from the thrift store, its cover faded and soft from age, and filled it with fragments, memories, lists, sentences that led nowhere but out of silence. Sometimes I wrote letters to Mark that I never sent. In one, I told him I hoped he was sleeping well. In another, I told him I no longer waited for his apology. The act of writing itself became the apology I had wanted, but now from me to myself. It said, "You survived, and that is enough." One day after class, B asked if I would read my piece aloud at a community reading. I said no at first. The idea of exposing the private geography of my grief to strangers felt unbearable. But that night, while washing dishes in the shared kitchen, I realized that my life had already been public in its humiliation. People knew the story of the house. The neighbors had whispered about it. The city records confirmed it. There was nothing left to protect but my own version of it. So the next week I agreed. The reading was held in the church basement, a room that smelled of old hymnals and wet coats. About 20 people came, most of them gray-haired, some holding cups of coffee that steamed in the cold air. When my turn came, my hands shook, but my voice didn't. I read about signing the papers in the hospital, about the nurse's well-meaning smile, about the feeling of turning a key that no longer fit a lock. I didn't cry. When I finished, there was silence, then quiet applause, the kind that feels like a blessing rather than approval. Afterward, a woman approached me and said, "My daughter did something similar. Hearing you made me feel less crazy." That sentence stayed in my chest like a small, steady flame. It was around that time I moved into the little studio above the bakery. The landlord knew me from my years there, and when he mentioned the space was vacant, I asked if I could take it. It was small, One room, a sink, a narrow balcony, but it smelled of flour and mornings, and that was enough. From my window, I could see the street where people lined up for bread each day. I furnished the place with thrift store finds and a rug someone had left in the alley. The day I moved in, I baked a single loaf of bread in a toaster oven and ate it slowly, as if tasting proof that I still existed. I began to spend time with the people from the writing class outside of Thursdays. We met in cafes, shared old stories, traded books. One of them, a widower named Arthur, had kind eyes and a clumsy way of pouring tea. He talked about birds and jazz, about the wife he still dreamed of. We walked together sometimes, not touching, just sharing the same pace. I didn't feel romance, not exactly, something gentler, like companionship that didn't demand anything but presence. One evening he said, "You write about your son without hatred. That's rare." I told him hatred was a luxury for those who still expect justice. He nodded and said, "Then what do you expect?" I thought for a long time before answering. "Peace," I said finally, "just peace." Around the same time, I decided to visit the old neighborhood. I told myself it was to see how the garden looked, but really it was to test whether I could face it without breaking. The street looked smaller, the trees taller. The house had been repainted pale yellow, the fence replaced with iron. I stood across the road for a long time, watching the curtains flutter in the window that had once been my kitchen. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch. A woman stepped out with a bag of groceries, humming. For a moment, I imagined she might glance up and see me, recognize something in my face, perhaps feel the ghost of what she now owned. But she didn't look up. And to my own surprise, I didn't mind. I turned and walked away. It was the first time I'd left that street without tears. After that day, something shifted permanently. The past no longer felt like a trap, but like a room I could visit and leave at will. I began to take pleasure in the smallest things again. The sound of rain on the bakery roof, the sight of the river catching the last light of evening, the way Arthur's laugh filled the space between sentences. I started saving for small luxuries, not for emergencies. A new coat from the thrift store, a pair of warm boots, a real radio, instead of the crackling one I'd kept from the boarding house. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a punishment, but a possibility. That spring, Bea announced she was retiring from teaching. On her last day, she handed each of us a small card with one sentence written on it. Mine said, "Freedom doesn't arrive, it accumulates." I taped it above my desk, next to a photo of my husband and me standing in front of the old house, years before Mark was born. Their faces don't haunt me anymore. They remind me that I have already lived many versions of myself. And this one, quiet and unremarkable as it may appear, is the freest of them all. The shift had happened quietly, almost invisibly. There was no dramatic gesture, no declaration of independence, just a slow unwinding of fear, a reclamation of breath. I had spent years defining myself through what was taken. Now I was beginning to define myself through what remained. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough to stand, to write, to wake without dread. And in that modest sufficiency, I recognized something like grace. The year the bakery building was finally sold again, the city seemed to lose its rhythm. Construction crews tore up the sidewalks, rerouted the buses, and filled the air with the smell of asphalt and noise. I had been living in my small studio for nearly 3 years by then, long enough for the neighbors to stop introducing themselves, long enough for the landlady to trust me with her spare key. Life had settled into something that felt durable. Mornings spent writing, afternoons volunteering, evenings walking to the river to watch the lights of the bridge blink on one by one. There was no drama in it, no tragedy left to unfold, and I had come to think that perhaps the worst of my life had already been spent. Then one evening, while I was drinking tea and listening to the radio, a name caught my ear, a familiar rhythm of syllables I hadn't heard aloud in years. The announcer was reading from a list of recent bankruptcy filings in the city, real estate firms, one after another, casualties of some economic downturn. Among them was my son's. For a moment I thought I'd misheard. I leaned closer to the radio, my pulse thudding in my throat. The announcer moved on quickly to other news, as if that brief mention had not upended a woman's breathing in a small apartment above a bakery. I turned the dial off and sat in silence, waiting for the world to steady. The cup in my hand had gone cold. There was no satisfaction in what I'd heard, no triumphant sense of balance being restored. Instead, there was confusion, almost grief, the strange disorientation that comes when the person who destroyed you finally begins to destroy himself. I sat by the window until the streetlights flickered on, the tea forgotten beside me, and tried to decide what it meant. The next morning, I bought a newspaper. His name was there again, buried in the business section, accompanied by the words, "Fraud investigation pending." The article was clinical, a few paragraphs describing a string of failed developments, investors left unpaid, assets seized. His face wasn't printed, but I could see it anyway, older now, I imagined, lined by stress, perhaps dulled by whatever arrogance had sustained him. I thought of his wife, the one who'd answered the phone years ago with the voice of polite dismissal. I wondered if she was still with him, or if she had already packed her jewelry and gone back to her parents, blaming the economy for what had always been greed. In the days that followed, I found myself reading everything I could about the collapse. It was as though I needed to understand the anatomy of his downfall to map the same terrain of deceit from a different angle. Each article felt like a piece of evidence in a trial I hadn't realized I was still conducting. I clipped the stories and tucked them into my notebook, not out of spite, but for documentation, as if my private history required official confirmation. Celine, who still visited now and then, noticed the stack of papers on my table and asked if they upset me. I told her they didn't. What I didn't tell her was that I was beginning to feel something close to release. Weeks passed, and the headlines grew more severe. There were lawsuits, public accusations, the foreclosure of the condo where he'd once lived. His name became a byword for the kind of small-time corruption people tut about over breakfast. One evening, as I walked home from the community center, I passed a group of men reading a newspaper at the bus stop. They were laughing at a story about a developer who had lost everything. I didn't need to ask which one. The cadence of the laughter told me. I walked faster, not from shame, but from the peculiar intimacy of hearing a stranger mock your own blood. Eventually, the coverage faded. The city found new scandals, new names to devour. Life returned to its usual hum. I stopped checking the papers. I told myself that whatever happened to him was none of my concern. Yet sometimes, in the quiet of evening, I found myself wondering where he slept, what he ate, whether he still wore the watch his father had given him. I told myself these questions were remnants of habit, not affection. But blood is stubborn. It stains even the most determined forgiveness. Then, one afternoon, while leaving the thrift store, I saw him. It was late winter, the air heavy with the smell of exhaust and thawing snow. I was waiting at a traffic light when I noticed a figure across the street, sitting against the brick wall of a closed pharmacy. He was thinner, older, his hair streaked with gray. His clothes were neat in the way that desperation tries to mimic dignity. Beside him was a cardboard sign, its letters uneven, "Will work for food." I might not have recognized him at first, if not for the way he held himself, upright even in collapse, the posture of someone who once believed the world owed him symmetry. I froze. The light changed. Cars moved. People passed around me, but I couldn't. My cane slipped slightly, and I steadied myself against a lamppost. The sight of him didn't bring the vindication I'd once imagined. Instead, it cracked open a space inside me that I had spent years bricking over. For a long moment, I watched him without moving, just absorbing the fact that he was real and within reach, not a headline or a memory, but flesh, fragile and cold. He didn't see me at first. His eyes were lowered, scanning the pavement for nothing in particular. I wanted to leave, to turn down the next street and carry the image with me like a secret victory. But something, duty, curiosity, the final tether of motherhood, pulled me forward. I crossed the street slowly, each step deliberate, my heart pounding not from anger, but from a strange, aching recognition. When I stopped in front of him, he looked up, blinking as though adjusting to light. For a second, there was no recognition, only confusion. Then it came, flooding his face with disbelief and something like fear. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking on the word. I stood there, silent, taking in the ruin of him. His cheeks were hollow, his hands trembling slightly. There was no arrogance left, none of the polished assurance he once wore like armor, just a man stripped of every illusion, sitting on the same streets where he had once built his career on other people's dreams. He tried to rise, but his knees faltered. "I can explain," he began, the old reflex still there, the need to narrate his failures into something noble. I shook my head. "Don't," I said quietly. "Not now." I reached into my bag and took out the sandwich I had bought for myself earlier, a simple thing wrapped in brown paper. I placed it beside him. For a moment he stared at it, then at me. His lips trembled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words should have pierced me, but they didn't. They landed softly, like rain on already wet ground. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said, and it was true. Forgiveness had ceased to be a moral act. It was just a practical necessity, a way to keep my soul uncluttered. "You said I'd be better off somewhere smaller," I added. "You were right." He looked down, and I saw tears gather in the lines of his face. People were passing us, glancing quickly away in that careful city manner that refuses to acknowledge collapse. I felt an impulse to kneel beside him, to lift his head, to smooth the hair from his forehead like I used to when he was a child. But I didn't. Compassion, I'd learned, is not the same as rescue. Instead, I reached out and touched his shoulder. Once, lightly, a gesture of recognition rather than comfort. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. The air felt strangely clean as I crossed the street. My cane tapped steadily against the pavement, each sound a heartbeat of release. When I reached the corner, I paused only once, not to check on him, but to catch my breath. The world around me moved as it always had. Cars passing, people talking, a street musician playing an old tune on his guitar. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I was no longer the mother abandoned, nor the victim of a legal theft. I was simply a woman who had survived long enough to see the cycle complete itself. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window and watched the lights flicker in the bakery below. The new owners had renovated it, painted the walls a bright cream, hung potted plants by the door. The smell of bread drifted upward, warm and thick. I thought of Mark sitting on the cold pavement, of the sandwich I'd left him. I wondered whether he ate it, whether he tasted the years in it, the small, patient years I had spent rebuilding what he had destroyed. Then I let the thought go. In the following days, I expected some repercussion, a phone call, a letter, a knock at the door, but none came. The city swallowed him the way it does everyone who falls. Occasionally I thought I saw him at a distance, a figure moving through crowds with the uncertain gait of someone unmoored. Once, near the market, I caught a glimpse of a man who looked like him pushing a cart of scrap metal. I didn't approach. Each sighting felt less like recognition and more like memory rehearsing itself. Strangely, peace didn't arrive as triumph. It came as exhaustion, the deep exhale of a life finally allowed to rest. I began to write again, not about the house or the betrayal, but about ordinary things. The color of dawn over the river, the sound of Celine's laughter when she called from her new home by the sea, the way the bakery's new sign caught the sun each morning. The more I wrote, the smaller the past became, until it was just one paragraph in a long story that no longer revolved around pain. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the city grew still, I would think of him. Not with anger or pity, but with a kind of weary kinship. We were both, in our different ways, architects of loss. He had built his downfall from greed. I had built my endurance from silence. Perhaps, I thought, that was the truest inheritance between us. The shared knowledge that everything we own is temporary. One evening, months after that encounter, I walked again to the river. The air was cool, the water reflecting the amber glow of the street lamps. I stood at the railing and watched the current carry away the debris of the day. Leaves, plastic bottles, fragments of lives briefly visible before they disappeared. I reached into my coat pocket and found the old silver key I'd kept all these years, the one that didn't open anything. For a long time, I turned it between my fingers, feeling the cold metal warm in my palm. Then, without ceremony, I dropped it into the water. It vanished with barely a sound. As I stood there, I felt no sadness, only the steady certainty that everything had completed itself. Somewhere out there, my son was learning what I had learned years before, that survival is not guaranteed by ownership, and that nothing you steal can ever truly belong to you. I walked home slowly, the city unfolding around me like a map I finally understood. When I reached my building, I paused at the bakery door, inhaled the scent of fresh bread, and whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. It was not gratitude for justice or revenge, but for the simple endurance of still being here, breathing, watching the night settle over a world that no longer owed me anything. It happened on a day that looked ordinary enough to pass unnoticed. A gray morning in early autumn when the sky hung low and indifferent over the city. I had gone out to buy coffee beans and a loaf of bread, the kind of small errand that fills the space between solitude and purpose. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, and the streets were slick with the thin film that always comes before the real storm. I remember the way my reflection trembled in the shop window as I walked past, faint and insubstantial, as though I were still half ghost and half witness to my own life. It had been nearly a year since I'd seen Mark on the street, that day with the sandwich, and in all that time I had not spoken his name aloud to anyone. The city, like a merciful conspirator, had kept our silence intact. But that morning, as I turned the corner toward the market, I saw him again. He was standing near the fountain in the square, not sitting this time, not begging, just standing, as if waiting for something to happen that would decide whether he would keep standing at all. His clothes were cleaner than before, but worn. The edges of the collar frayed, his shoes cracked from too much walking. There was no sign or cup this time, only a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and the unmistakable air of someone who had run out of illusions but not yet out of breath. I felt my body still itself before my mind had time to think. I could have walked away. I could have turned down any of the 100 streets that promised anonymity. But there was something in the way he looked at the fountain, eyes fixed and unfocused, that made me stop. It wasn't pity that held me there. It was recognition. He looked exactly as I had felt the day I lost the house, disbelieving, hollow, waiting for the world to tell him what to do next. He saw me before I moved. His eyes widened, and for a second I thought he might run. Then he did something that startled me more than flight. He smiled. It was small, tentative, the smile of a child rehearsing good manners. I crossed the distance between us slowly, aware of the people passing, of the wind pushing leaves across the pavement, of the ache in my hip that flared when I walked too fast. When I reached him, he said my name, not Mom this time, just Eleanor, as if calling me that might erase the history between us, level the ground for conversation. I answered calmly, "You look thinner." It was the only thing that came to mind, the only sentence neutral enough to exist in the fragile air between us. He laughed, a short sound that carried both relief and shame. "I've been trying to get clean," he said, eyes darting to the ground. "It's harder than I thought." I didn't ask what he meant. Clean from what? Guilt or chemicals, or the debris of his own arrogance? He went on talking, words spilling like stones. The fraud charges had been dropped for lack of evidence. He'd been sleeping at a shelter, sometimes working odd jobs, sometimes not. His wife had left with most of what was left, and the investors he'd cheated had taken care of the rest. He told it not as confession, but as inventory, as though reciting losses could turn them into assets. I listened because listening was the last courtesy I could afford him. Every so often he glanced at me, trying to read whether I was judging or forgiving, but I kept my face steady, the way you do when someone is drowning and you know jumping in will only pull you down too. Finally, he stopped speaking and looked at me with something close to defiance. "You probably think I deserve it," he said. I thought about that for a long moment before answering. "Deserve is a word people use when they still believe in fairness," I said. "I stopped believing in that a long time ago." He swallowed hard and nodded. "I don't expect you to help me," he said, and there was the slightest tremor in his voice. "Good," I replied, "because I can't." For a while we stood there in silence, the fountain behind us murmuring its endless loop of recycled water, the wind tugging at our coats. I could feel the weight of all the years pressing between us. The child he'd been, the man he became, the mother I once was. I wanted to tell him that I had loved him once with the kind of love that believed itself indestructible, and that love, in its blindness, had made both of us fools. But words like that are too heavy for moments like this. They don't heal, they only reopen. Instead, I said something that surprised me with its calmness. "I don't hate you, Mark. I just don't belong to you anymore." He looked startled, as if I had spoken in another language. "You're still my mother," he said quickly, desperate to assert the one truth that hadn't yet been repossessed. "That's biology," I said quietly. "But belonging, that's a choice, and I stopped choosing it." The words came out softer than I expected. Not cruel, just final. He stared at me for a long time, his mouth tightening, his eyes shining with something that wasn't quite tears. "You used to say blood was everything," he said. "And I was wrong," I replied. "Blood is just what you clean up when the fight is over." He turned away then, wiping at his face, his shoulders trembling. I thought he might curse or walk off, but instead he took a deep breath and said, "I know you don't owe me anything." but could you at least tell me how to start over? The question broke something small and quiet inside me. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone, the child's tone, the same one that had once asked how to tie a shoe or read a clock. For the first time in years, I saw not the man who had stolen from me, but the boy who had once depended on me to teach him the shape of the world. I wanted to tell him that starting over is just another name for living without illusions, that forgiveness is not something you receive, but something you learn to do alone. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out the envelope where I kept some emergency cash, and handed him 2 bills. "This isn't help," I said. "It's a beginning. Make it count or don't." He took the money slowly, his fingers brushing mine. "Thank you," he whispered, but I didn't answer. I turned and began to walk away. Behind me, I heard him say my name once more, soft and almost reverent, but I didn't stop. The square opened into a narrow street lined with old plane trees, their leaves beginning to fall in clusters. My steps were unsteady but sure. Each one felt like a closing door, like the world folding neatly behind me. When I reached the end of the street, I paused and looked back. He was still there, standing by the fountain, staring at the water as if it might tell him something. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was a kind of solemn recognition that this was the last time our lives would ever intersect. There would be no dramatic reconciliation, no final letter, no cinematic redemption. We had both exhausted our parts in each other's stories. I had given him what remained of my compassion, and he had given me the one thing I never expected: closure. Not the tidy, sentimental kind, but the quiet, irrevocable realization that there was nothing left to salvage. That evening, I went home and sat at my desk by the window. The air smelled faintly of yeast from the bakery below. I opened my notebook and began to write, not about him this time, but about the act of release itself. I wrote that forgiveness is not an absolution, but a boundary, that it allows you to stand on one side of your own history and say, "I came this far and no farther." I wrote until the words blurred, until the page filled with the rhythm of my own breathing. When I finally looked up, the room was dark except for the streetlight spilling through the curtain. Later, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the rain begin to fall. Each drop struck the glass with a small, deliberate sound, steady and cleansing. I thought about how, for years, I had imagined that healing would arrive like thunder, a sudden, dramatic absolution. Instead, it came like this, soft, persistent, ordinary. It came as the sound of rain and the taste of tea and the awareness that I had survived something that was supposed to end me. I didn't see Mark again after that. The city swallowed him quietly, as it does with so many who lose their footing. But sometimes, walking through the market or waiting for the bus, I catch glimpses of men who look like him, tired, searching, half hoping for recognition, and I feel nothing but a faint echo of tenderness. Not love, not even nostalgia, just a quiet wish that they find some small mercy in the world. Because I have learned that mercy, once it enters you, becomes a kind of inheritance you can't revoke. That night, as the rain deepened, I opened the window and let the cool air wash through the room. I breathed it in, the scent of wet earth and bread and new beginnings. Somewhere below, the bakery doors shut with a soft clang, and I felt the vibration through the floorboards. For the first time in many years, I said a prayer, not for Mark, not even for myself, but for the house that once held us both, for its walls and its roof and its quiet endurance. I thanked it for sheltering me, even in memory, and then very quietly, I let it go. When I went to bed, the bracelet from the hospital lay on my nightstand. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and realized the plastic had grown brittle with time. I bent it gently until it snapped. The sound was small but satisfying, the sound of an old tether giving way. I placed the pieces in the trash and switched off the light. In the darkness, I felt the weight of my years settle evenly across me, not as burden, but as blanket. I closed my eyes and thought, not of betrayal, but of bread rising somewhere below, of water flowing endlessly through the fountain, of the quiet, relentless pulse of life that keeps going long after all the debts have been forgiven. The last winter of my story arrived without ceremony. The first snow came overnight, covering the city in a muted calm that made even the traffic seem considerate. I woke to the sound of the bakery shutters lifting and the faint hum of the ovens below me. For a long while, I simply lay there, listening. The walls of this small studio held a silence that was no longer empty, but earned. A kind of silence that only appears after years of noise have exhausted themselves. I sat up slowly, my body stiff but familiar, and felt an odd steadiness move through me, the way still water sometimes hides a powerful current. It took me a moment to realize that I no longer woke with dread. The ghosts had all grown quiet, not because I banished them, but because they finally understood they no longer ruled this place. I brewed tea and stood by the window, watching the street below. The snow made everything softer, the roofs, the signs, the faces of people hurrying past with their collars turned up. Across the way, a boy was helping his grandmother carry groceries. Their laughter rose through the cold like smoke. I found myself smiling, not from envy but from recognition. I used to believe that happiness was something that belonged only to youth, something fragile and fast. But I see now that happiness can be slower, quieter, built out of endurance rather than excitement. Mine had been built brick by brick, morning by morning, out of the simple act of choosing to live. It had been months since I last saw Mark. Sometimes, when I passed the square where I'd left him by the fountain, I would pause without meaning to, as if some invisible thread still tied me to that spot. But the thread was thinner now, almost translucent. I had stopped wondering where he was or whether he had survived the winter. The not knowing was its own peace, a kind of mercy I granted both of us. Life, I've learned, doesn't owe you closure. It only offers continuation, and if you're wise enough, that's more than enough. I wrote his name once in my notebook that winter, then crossed it out, not from anger, but from completion. The bakery downstairs changed hands again. The new owners were a young couple who played music in the mornings, soft jazz that drifted up through my floorboards. Sometimes the woman would send up a roll or a slice of pie as thanks for helping her with the paperwork she struggled to understand. I'd sit at my little table with the pastry and the radio on low, and the smell of cinnamon would fill the air until it felt like a home someone had remembered for me. My fern had grown tall enough to touch the curtain, its leaves unfurling greedily toward the light. I often thought that if a plant could survive this long in such a small space, so could I. One morning in late February, I walked to the river again. The snow had begun to melt, and the paths were slick with slush, but the water moved strong and sure beneath the ice. I leaned against the railing, watching fragments of ice drift past, each piece catching the gray light before dissolving into the current. There was a faint metallic smell in the air, the scent of thaw and new beginnings. I reached into my coat pocket, half expecting to find something to throw into the water, a note, a trinket, some physical symbol of release. But there was nothing left to let go of. Everything I needed to surrender had already dissolved. slowly and invisibly, like the ice beneath me. It struck me then how strange it was to stand in the same city, breathe the same air, and yet inhabit a completely different life. I thought about the woman I had been when I woke in that hospital bed years ago, still dazed from anesthesia, believing the world would remain faithful because she had been. I wanted to reach back and tell her that faith is not about keeping what you love safe. It's about surviving its loss. I wanted to tell her that one day she would live in a room that smelled of bread and ink, that she would write again, laugh again, and find herself in the sound of her own voice. But of course, you can't send messages backward through time. You can only live them forward until the lesson arrives on its own. When I returned home, I spent the afternoon cleaning, not because it needed it, but because movement helps me think. I wiped the window sills, folded my linens, rearranged the few books I owned. Each small act of order felt like a way of telling the universe I was ready for whatever remained. As dusk fell, I sat by the window once more and opened my notebook. I began to write what I knew would be the last page. I wrote that peace isn't the absence of pain, but the ability to hold it without breaking, that forgiveness is not a gift to the other, but a declaration of freedom to yourself. I wrote that love, once stripped of need and expectation, becomes the purest kind of solitude, a quiet companionship with your own soul. And then I signed my name at the bottom, not as a plea, not as a prayer, but as a fact. Night settled fully outside, the snow now gleaming under the lamplight. I could hear the laughter of people leaving the bakery, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of a city still alive. I made myself another cup of tea and sat in the glow of the single lamp, the one I had found years ago in the thrift store and kept ever since. The light was soft, golden, forgiving. It touched the edges of my hands, my notebook, the photograph of my husband and me on our wedding day. I realized I was no longer afraid of endings. They weren't erasures. They were simply the natural punctuation of living. Before bed, I stood at the window once more and whispered, almost without realizing it, a message I knew would drift beyond me. If they steal your roof, build a garden. If they sell your house, sell your fear. What they take is never who you are. The words came out warm, steady, and certain. Then I closed the curtains and turned off the lamp. The darkness was kind, full, complete. I lay down, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and listened to the sound of the city breathing around me, the hum of life continuing, the heartbeat of a world that had finally stopped demanding my pain. I thought of the bread that would rise in the ovens below before dawn, of the river carrying its slow current toward the sea, and of the quiet, enduring truth that I had made it through. When sleep came, it was not a surrender, but a homecoming, the kind that requires no address, no deed, no witness, only the knowledge that you belong entirely and at last to yourself.